"Dad will be in memory care by Friday," my daughter whispered. "After that, the trust is ours." She said it behind the pantry door, while I stood 3 feet away holding a grocery bag against my hip and pretending to search for the light switch. The refrigerator hummed. Rain tapped the kitchen windows. Somewhere in the living room, my granddaughter Lily was watching a cartoon and laughing at a joke she was too young to understand. I understood every word. My daughter Claire lowered her voice. "Mason, you can't keep talking like that. He's still my father." "He fell on the stairs, Claire. He forgot the name of his own accountant last week. The doctor said stress can make confusion worse. By Friday, we get the doctor to sign the form and Daniel Cho won't be able to stop the transfer." My hand tightened around the grocery bag. Inside it, a jar of peach preserves pressed into a loaf of bread and began to crack the paper. Daniel Cho was my estate attorney. He had handled my first company sale, my wife's final medical bills, and the trust I created for Claire and Lily after my wife died. Daniel did not sign anything without calling me first. He especially did not approve a transfer of control, because my son-in-law had decided I was confused. "And the Mercer building?" Claire asked. Mason laughed softly. "That's the whole point. Once the trust controls it, we sell it. The buyer's ready. We use the money to clear my business debt, and your father gets a comfortable room where nurses can watch him. Everybody wins. Everybody except me." I looked down at the left hand that had built Mercer Climate Systems from a rented pickup and a toolbox. That hand had signed payroll checks for 30 years. It had held Claire when she had a fever at 6, steadied Lily's bicycle at 7, and buried my wife, Margaret's wedding ring, in the pocket of a black suit, because I could not bear to leave it in the bedroom. Now Mason wanted that hand to sign away the only thing I had promised to protect. The pantry door opened an inch. Claire's face appeared first. Her eyes were red, but I could not tell whether she had been crying or practicing. "Dad," she said. I turned toward her and lifted the grocery bag. "Peaches were on sale. Lily likes them on toast." Behind Claire, Mason stood with his phone face down in his palm. He smiled like a man who had just found a locked door and already owned the key. I smiled back. Then I placed the groceries on the counter, kissed my daughter on the forehead, and asked the question that made Mason stop breathing for half a second. "What happens on Friday?" Claire's fingers closed around the edge of her sweater. Mason answered too quickly, and the speed of his answer became the first real piece of evidence I had. People who are innocent usually explain. People who are prepared usually redirect. Mason recovered first. He always did. When a conversation turned against him, he filled the silence with concern. "Friday," he repeated. "We were talking about Lily's school appointment." Claire looked at him before she looked at me. That small movement told me more than an answer could have. I took the jar of preserves from the torn bag and set it beside the sink. "Lily's appointment is Wednesday. Her teacher emailed me." Mason's smile remained, but the muscles around his eyes tightened. "Right, Wednesday. Friday is the follow-up." "For what?" "For your fall." There it was. The story they had prepared. 3 weeks earlier, I had slipped on the back steps while carrying a box of old company invoices. I landed hard enough to bruise my ribs and split the skin above my eyebrow. I spent one night at the hospital because Claire insisted. The scans were clean. The doctor told me to use the handrail and stop carrying boxes like I was still 30. I did not forget my accountant's name. I had never forgotten it. I had called him Mr. Bell because that was his last name, while Mason later told Claire I had called him the dentist. A small mistake became a symptom. A symptom became a story. A story became a legal strategy. I was 67, widowed, and living alone in the house Margaret and I bought when Claire was 4. That made me vulnerable in a way I had refused to admit aloud. People saw an older man with property investments and a daughter who visited often. They did not see the hours I spent awake after midnight listening to the house settle around me. My trust was simple. Claire would receive the income from the Mercer building when I died. Lily would receive the property itself when she turned 25. Until then, Daniel Cho would manage it with another independent trustee. I built that structure after watching 2 friends lose everything when their adult children married people who saw family as a balance sheet themselves. I had told Claire the reason. I had shown her every page. She had cried and said she understood. Mason had asked whether an independent trustee was necessary. I had said yes. The next morning, Claire brought me coffee and a folder. She placed it on the dining table like it contained a birthday card. "This is just a temporary care plan," she said. "It protects you if the fall happens again." I did not open the folder. I watched her thumb rub the corner of the paper. "Who wrote it?" "Mason found a template online." "A template for what?" She swallowed. "For letting us help with decisions." I looked at the signature line near the bottom. My name was printed there in a font that tried to imitate my handwriting. The signature looked close. Close enough to fool a stranger, not close enough to fool the man who had signed his name every day for 50 years. Claire sat across from me while the coffee cooled. She wore the blue sweater Margaret had given her. I had kept it in a cedar box because Claire said it made her feel protected. Seeing it on her made the room feel like an altered photograph. "You don't have to sign today," she said. That sentence was designed to sound gentle. It also told me the signature was the destination. I turned the first page. The document called itself a Temporary Family Support Authorization. It allowed Claire and Mason to communicate with doctors, access financial statements, coordinate property expenses, and make decisions if I became unable to act independently. The phrase was wide enough to swallow my entire life. "Who is the doctor on Friday?" I asked. Claire's hands moved into her lap. "Dr. Patel. My doctor is Elaine Watkins." Dr. Patel is a specialist. Mason thought another opinion would help. Mason thought many things helped when they helped him. I read the second page. It listed the Mercer building as a property requiring immediate management. It mentioned a possible sale and an unnamed buyer. The document said I had expressed concern about being unable to maintain the property. I had never said that. I had just approved a new roof inspection and signed a lease with a dental practice. At the bottom was a line that said I had requested Claire and Mason become temporary co-managers. I looked up. "Did I say this?" Claire stared at the table. "You said you were tired. That is not the same thing. Dad, you keep treating this like we're taking something from you. We're trying to keep everything from falling apart." "What is falling apart?" Her eyes filled. For 1 second, she looked like the little girl who used to sleep beside Margaret during thunderstorms. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down, and the emotion disappeared. Mason had sent a message. I did not see the words, but I saw her face change after reading them. Her shoulders lifted, her mouth closed. She became careful. "You should sign before you get more confused," she said. The sentence was not hers. Claire had never spoken to me that way. I folded the document and put it back in the folder. "I'll review it with Daniel. Daniel will make everything complicated. That is why I pay him." Mason entered the room carrying Lily's pink backpack. He had been listening from the hallway. "Daniel is old-fashioned, Frank. This is a family matter." I smiled. "Then the family should have no problem waiting for the family attorney." Mason's expression hardened. Lily came in behind him. Her hair was tied with 2 yellow ribbons, but one had come loose. She placed her backpack on the floor and looked at the folder. "Grandpa," she said, "are you going to live somewhere else?" Claire stood too quickly. "Lily, go get your shoes." Lily did not move. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded drawing. "I made this for you," she said. The picture showed our house a red door and 3 people holding hands. Under the house she had drawn a small black rectangle. On the back, in uneven pencil, she had written 6 words. "Mason says don't tell Grandpa about the room." I folded Lily's drawing along the same creases she had made and slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket. I did not ask her what room she meant. Children tell the truth until adults teach them which truths are dangerous. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said. "I love the house you drew." Claire took Lily's hand. Mason picked up the backpack. Neither of them looked at me as they walked toward the front door. Before they left, Mason turned around. "Your appointment is Friday at 10. Dr. Patel will come here. It will be easier for everyone if you cooperate." I don't remember agreeing to an appointment. Claire scheduled it. Claire flinched as if he had pushed her. The door closed. Their car backed down the driveway. I waited until the taillights disappeared before taking the drawing from my pocket. The black rectangle under the house was not a room in our home. It was a storage unit at the Mercer Building, a 3-story brick property on East Broad Street. I owned it through a holding company, and the trust named Lily as its future beneficiary. The building housed 6 small offices, a physical therapy clinic, 2 apartments, and the locked archive room, where I kept old contracts, payroll records, and the original files from Mercer Climate Systems. That archive also contained the first version of my trust. Margaret and I had stored the files there because the house basement flooded twice. Daniel knew the room existed. Claire knew it was locked. Mason had never been given a key. At least he had not been given one by me. I called the building manager, then stopped before the call connected. If Mason had already placed his hands on the property, a phone call would warn him. I needed to know what he had done before I showed him I was awake. I drove to East Broad in my old silver Ford. The Mercer Building looked the same as it had for 20 years, red brick white window frames, a faded brass sign, and a side entrance that stuck when the weather turned wet. Inside, the hallway smelled like floor wax, and the coffee brewed by the physical therapist downstairs. The manager, Thomas Reed, met me beside the mailboxes. "You came early," he said. "Did anyone ask for the archive room?" Thomas hesitated. "Your son-in-law came Tuesday. He said you told him to review leases." My heart began beating harder. "Did you let him in?" He had a key. I had changed the archive lock after a former employee left. I had given new keys only to Thomas Rosa Alvarez and Daniel Cho. "What kind of key?" Thomas reached into his desk and brought out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph from the security camera. Mason stood at the archive door at 11:48 p.m. The image showed him holding a brass key and looking directly at the camera. Behind him, the red light above the lock was already green. Someone had opened the room before he arrived. Thomas gave me the security log without asking why I wanted it. He had worked for me long enough to understand that silence sometimes protected the wrong person. The log showed 3 entries. At 11:48 p.m., Mason entered the archive room. At 12:06 a.m., he left. At 12:17 a.m., the door opened again, but the camera caught only a shadow. The person wore a hooded jacket and carried a phone with the flashlight on. "Was the camera working during the second entry?" I asked. "It recorded the image. The face was covered." I studied the shadow. The person was shorter than Mason and moved with a limp. "Did you see anyone else in the building?" Thomas shook his head. "The side alarm didn't trigger. Whoever it was used a valid key." I took a photograph of the screen with my phone, then asked for a copy of the log. Thomas printed it on his office printer and signed the bottom. "What did Mason say he needed?" "Lease records. He said you were considering a sale." I had not told Mason about a sale. I had not told anyone except Rosa and Daniel that a commercial developer had sent an inquiry 2 months earlier. I rejected it because the offer was below the building's value and because selling would remove Lily's future security. The developer's name appeared on the email in my private inbox, Northstar Urban Holdings. I drove to the Mercer office and called Rosa from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring. "Tell me you are not about to make a decision without breakfast," she said. "I need the company access report for the last 60 days. The humor left her voice. "Why?" "Mason entered the archive room last night." There was a pause. Rosa had known Margaret knew the archive was more than a storage space and understood that Mason had never been authorized to enter it. "I'll pull the report," she said. "Give me 20 minutes. The report showed a login to the company accounting system at 2:13 a.m. on 3 separate nights. The user ID belonged to Claire. The device location was the home office where Mason kept his laptop. I called Claire. She answered in a whisper. "Dad, I can't talk right now." "Did you log into the company system at 2:13 this morning?" Her breathing changed. "No." "Did you give Mason your password?" "He helps me with bills." "That wasn't my question." She said nothing. Behind her, I heard a cabinet close. Then Mason's voice, distant but sharp. "Who are you talking to?" Claire ended the call. Rosa sent a second file. It contained the names of documents opened through Claire's account, the trust summary, the Mercer Building lease schedule, and an employee list. One file had been downloaded to Mason's laptop. Its name was Capacity_Assessment. _supporting_notes. I stared at that file name until the letters blurred. It was not a medical record. It was a plan pretending to be one, and somebody had already decided that my confusion would be more convenient than my consent. Daniel Cho had a rule about panic. He never argued with it. He put it on a chair, gave it a glass of water, and asked it to wait until the facts arrived. He met me at his office that afternoon. The building smelled of lemon polish and old paper. Daniel had practiced law for 28 years, but he still kept a wooden ruler on his desk because he believed every document should be read line by line. I placed the care plan in front of him. He did not touch it immediately. "Who gave you this?" "Claire." Mason called it temporary. Daniel read the first page, then the second. When he reached the signature line, his eyes stopped. "You did not sign this." "No." "Did you authorize anyone to sign for you?" "No." He picked up a magnifying glass from the drawer. I expected him to laugh at the imitation. Instead, his expression became quiet. "This is not a casual forgery," he said. "Someone copied a signature and embedded it in a document that has been formatted to look official. That does not prove who created it, but it does prove that somebody planned ahead." I told him about the pantry conversation, the Friday appointment, the building key, and the late-night login. I told him about Lily's drawing. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he turned the drawing over. He did not ask whether Lily understood the word memory care. He asked where the black rectangle was. "The archive room at the Mercer building." "What is there?" "Original trust documents, company records, copies of the lease history." Daniel leaned back. "Then we have two separate problems. One is family pressure. The other is unauthorized access to records that could be used to support a property transfer. Can Mason take the building? Not because he says so. But if a court believes you cannot manage your affairs, temporary control can become expensive and difficult to unwind. That is why capacity disputes are dangerous. They turn uncertainty into leverage." He opened a file drawer and removed the signed original trust. "This stays here," he said. "You do not carry it home. You do not photograph it for anyone. We make a certified copy and record the chain of custody." I wanted a dramatic answer. I wanted Daniel to call the police, confront Mason, and place handcuffs on the man who had called himself my son. Daniel gave me a checklist instead. "Do not threaten him. Do not tell him what evidence you have. Do not sign anything. Keep your conversations calm. If Claire is involved, we need to learn whether she is choosing this or being pushed into it." That last sentence hurt more than the rest. "She was in the pantry," I said. "Being present is not the same as being free." Daniel handed me a clean notebook. "Write every contact, every date, every document. Memory is emotional. Notes are evidence." On the first page, I wrote the Friday deadline. Under it, Daniel wrote one sentence. "Find out who benefits if Frank Mercer is declared unable to speak for himself." The next morning, I called Rosa Alvarez and asked her to prepare a fictional sale packet for the Mercer building. "Fictional how?" she asked. "A buyer has made an offer. The building will close in 30 days. The offer requires a clean title and a new management company." Rosa was silent for a moment. "You want Mason to hear about it?" "I want to know who he tells." Rosa had worked beside me since Claire was a teenager. She knew how to read a balance sheet, a person's hesitation, and the difference between a mistake and a pattern. She did not ask whether this was legal. She asked Daniel to review the packet before anyone saw it. By noon, the packet existed. It contained no real buyer name, no actual signature, and no document that could transfer ownership. It was a controlled question dressed as a business opportunity. I left the packet in a locked drawer at the office and mentioned it to Mason during lunch. He had come over with 2 sandwiches and a cheerful expression. "Claire says you have been worrying about the building. I am considering a sale." The sandwich stopped halfway to his mouth. "A sale? A serious offer. You told me the building was for Lily." "Plans change." Mason set the sandwich down. His concern arrived too quickly and disappeared too slowly. "You should not make a decision while you are recovering." "Why not?" "Because a buyer will take advantage of you." "That is possible. The trust may not allow it." There it was again. Mason knew the trust restrictions. He knew that Daniel was the trustee. He knew more about the documents than a man who had never been invited to review them should know. "The buyer wants a meeting Friday afternoon," I said. Mason looked toward the kitchen. "Who is the buyer?" "I cannot discuss it yet." He rubbed his thumb against the edge of the table. "If you sell Claire and Lily lose their future, maybe they need a different future." His face changed. The polished son-in-law disappeared, and the man underneath looked tired and angry. "You cannot punish Claire because she is trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" He stood. The chair legs scraped the floor. "From making a mistake you cannot undo." I watched him leave without asking which mistake he meant. 20 minutes later, Rosa called. She had placed a harmless notice in the office printer queue so she could see who accessed it. Mason had entered the building using the visitor code. He had not gone to my office. He had gone straight to the printer. The fictional sale packet was still in the locked drawer, but the printer log showed that someone had searched for the phrase "new management company" on Claire's account 3 minutes earlier. I returned to my office and opened the drawer. The packet was untouched, yet the question had worked. Mason had not wanted the building sold. He had wanted the building available to him before anyone else could claim it. That difference changed the shape of the danger. Claire came back that evening alone. She parked at the curb instead of the driveway as if she did not want Mason to know she had entered the house. I found her standing in the hallway beneath the framed photograph of Margaret. Claire had her arms folded across her stomach. "Where is Mason?" I asked. "At home." "Does he know you are here?" She looked at me. "Why does that matter?" "Because your shoulders drop when he is not in the room," I thought. Instead, I said, "It matters because you seem frightened." Her eyes flashed. "I am not frightened. I am exhausted. There is a difference." She carried another folder. This one was thinner than the first. She placed it on the piano. "I need you to sign a temporary authorization. It only lets me help with appointments and bills." The first document also mentioned property management. Mason revised it. "Did he?" She pressed her lips together. "Dad, please. You keep acting like we are trying to steal your life. Your husband said the trust would be ours after Friday." Claire turned pale. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The rain tapped the windows again, the same gentle sound that had been in the kitchen when I overheard them. I realized how often betrayal arrived under ordinary weather. "You heard us," she said. "I heard you say I would be in memory care by Friday." "I did not mean it that way." "How did you mean it?" She sat on the piano bench. "Mason said the doctor could write a temporary recommendation. He said the recommendation would stop the bank from calling about our debts. He said we would only control the trust until he fixed the business." "What business?" She stared at the floor. "Mason's equipment company is behind on everything. Payroll taxes, suppliers. He said the Mercer building could be refinanced. He said if I did not help Lily and I would lose the house. There was the pressure Daniel had warned me about." Claire's fear had been turned into a leash. "Did you sign anything?" She shook her head. "Not the trust. He said I only had to get you to sign. And the forged signature." Her face collapsed. "I saw it," I said. "I did not make it." "But you brought it here." She covered her mouth with both hands. Then she whispered the phrase Mason had used the night before. "It is for your own good, Dad." I heard the words, but I also heard the fear underneath them. I did not tell her about the security footage, the printer log, or Daniel's certified copy. I only took the folder and placed it carefully beside the first one. "Go home," I said. "Tell Mason I'm still confused." She looked up. "What are you going to do now?" I closed the folder. "I am going to find out how much he thinks he already owns." She understood that I was not asking her to lie forever. I was asking for one careful day while we built a safer truth. The next morning, Lily called me from the school bus. She was not supposed to call during the ride, which meant something had happened before the driver pulled away. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you still have the room under the building?" "The archive room?" "I don't know. The black room." I sat at the kitchen table. "What did you see?" Her voice became small. "Mason took me there last weekend. He said he wanted to show me where our future was kept." My hand moved toward the notebook Daniel had given me. "What did he show you?" "A red folder. He said it had your name and Mommy's name. He told me not to touch it because grown-up things were inside." Then he said if I told you, you might send me away. The words came out in a rush. Fear had been sitting in her chest, waiting for a safe person. Lily, you did nothing wrong. You can always tell me when an adult says something that scares you, even if it's Mommy. That question hurt more than anything Mason had said. Especially then, I told her. But you do not have to investigate anything. You do not have to protect me. That is the grown-up's job. The bus driver announced her stop. Before she hung up, Lily said, "The red folder was in the blue cabinet. The cabinet has a broken handle." I drove to the Mercer building with the notebook on the passenger seat. Thomas let me into the archive room. The old brass key still worked, but the lock plate had fresh scratches around it. The room smelled of cardboard dust and the cedar oil Margaret used on the shelves. The blue cabinet stood against the far wall. Its handle had been broken for years. I had replaced it twice, and both replacements had failed. Inside, the Trust originals were still there. So were the old company ledgers, payroll files, and a box of photographs. The red folder was not on the first shelf. I searched the cabinet a second time. Behind a row of tax files, I found a narrow gap in the metal backing. Someone had pushed the folder behind it. The first page was a letter from Northstar Urban Holdings. The company wanted to purchase the Mercer building and 2 adjacent parcels. The offer was real, but the signature approving preliminary negotiations was not mine. The second page listed a consulting fee payable to Hale Equipment Recovery, Mason's company. The fee was $180,000. The third page was a photocopy of a medical form from a clinic I had never visited. It said I had experienced memory impairment and required supervised financial care. At the bottom was a handwritten note. Get Claire to confirm the story before Friday. I heard the archive door close behind me. Claire stood in the hallway. Her face was wet with rain, and her eyes went directly to the folder in my hands. "Dad," she said, "please don't read that." I held up the medical form. "You already read it." She looked away. "Then tell me which part is true." Claire stepped into the archive room and shut the door behind her. She did not ask how I had found the folder. She already knew Lily had told me, and the knowledge moved across her face like a shadow. "How long have you known?" I asked. "About the sale. About the plan to make me look incompetent." She looked at the red folder. "Mason told me the clinic form was only a draft. It has your initials on the approval page." I initialed a stack of papers. He said they were for the business loan. "Did you see my name?" "Not clearly." That answer was honest and terrible. I placed the folder on the work table. The fluorescent light above us flickered. For a moment I could hear Margaret's voice in the room telling me to stop trying to solve everything alone. "Why didn't you ask me?" I said. Claire's eyes filled. "Because Mason said you would cut us off." "Would I?" "You would have asked questions." "That is not the same thing. He said questions were how you punish people. He said if I told you about the debt, you would take Lily away from us." I felt anger rise, but underneath it was something heavier. Claire had not been thinking like a daughter. She had been thinking like a person trapped inside a story someone else wrote. "Has Mason threatened you?" She did not answer. "Claire," she sat in Margaret's old wooden chair. "He says he can prove I am unstable. He records me when I cry. He keeps messages from when I took anxiety medication after Lily was born. He says a judge would believe him if I tried to leave." The archive room became very quiet. "Does he hurt you?" "Not in a way that leaves marks." I had heard that sentence before from a coworker whose husband had broken furniture instead of bones. It was not an answer that made a father feel better. "Does he hurt Lily?" Claire shook her head quickly. "He scares her. He tells her the family will disappear if she talks." The red folder contained fraud. Claire's voice contained fear. Both required action, but not the same action. I called Daniel on speaker. He answered from court and listened while Claire explained what Mason had said. Daniel did not blame her. He asked 3 questions, then told her to stay somewhere safe if she believed Mason might retaliate. "Where can we go?" Claire asked. Daniel said, "Frank has a guest room. Rosa can meet you there. We will handle the rest through proper channels." Claire looked at me. I wanted to say yes immediately. I also knew that rescue without a plan could put her in greater danger. "You can come to my house," I said. But you must tell me the complete truth, even when it makes you look bad." She nodded. Then she pointed to the bottom of the red folder. "There is another page," she said. "Mason keeps it on his phone. It has the name of the person who paid him. Claire stayed at my house that night, but she did not sleep in the guest room. She sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in both hands and watched the screen as if Mason might reach through it. Daniel had arranged for Rosa to meet us at a small office above the physical therapy clinic. The room had 1 table, 4 chairs, and no family photographs. It was easier to speak there because nobody could pretend the past made the present safe. Claire told us about the debt in pieces. Mason's equipment company had lost 2 contracts. He replaced the missing money with loans from private lenders. When the lenders demanded repayment, he told Claire that a transfer from the Mercer Trust would solve everything. She refused at first. Then he showed her messages from her old therapist and said he would use them to prove she was unstable. He said Lily would be placed with relatives, Claire told us. He said I would never see her again. Rosa kept her hands flat on the table. "Did he say that in writing?" Claire nodded. "He sent voice messages. He does not like writing threats." "Do you still have them?" Daniel asked. "Some. He deletes them after I listen." "Does he record you?" Claire nodded again. "His phone is always near me. He says it is for safety. Once I asked him why he knew what I had said to my sister. He told me the walls were thin. I thought of the kitchen, the pantry door, the way Mason had stood with his phone face down in his palm. He was recording us that night," I said. Claire looked at me. "How do you know?" "Because he ended the conversation before I finished asking about Friday." Daniel leaned forward. "If he recorded the pantry conversation, it may be useful. But we cannot assume it proves the whole plan. A recording can be edited, misrepresented, or challenged. We need a pattern." Rosa opened her laptop. "I found another pattern. The North Star inquiry came through a broker who has done work for hail equipment recovery before. The broker's email signature uses a different company name, but the phone number matches a debt collection notice." Claire covered her face. "He told me North Star was an independent buyer," she said. "Maybe the buyer is real," Daniel said. "The question is who profits and who authorized the fee." I asked Claire whether she had access to Mason's phone. "No, he sleeps with it under his pillow." "Then we do not touch it," Daniel said. "We build a safe process that gives him the chance to reveal what he knows without placing Claire in danger. That process began with a decision I did not want to make. I had to let Mason believe he was winning. The next morning I called him and apologized for being suspicious. I told him the care plan had frightened me. I said I was willing to listen during Friday's appointment. He was quiet for so long that I could hear traffic through the receiver. Then he said, "I knew you would come around." The relief in his voice was not relief for my health. It was relief for his deadline. Claire did not want to go back home. She wanted to believe that leaving Mason would be as simple as putting clothes in a bag and turning a key. Daniel explained that fear made simple things dangerous. "Do not announce a separation until you have a safety plan," he told her. "Do not confront him alone. Keep copies of every message somewhere he cannot reach." Rosa arranged a room for Claire and Lily at her sister's house. It was not a permanent answer, but it gave them a place Mason did not know. For 2 days, Claire worked with Daniel and Rosa to rebuild the timeline. She wrote down every time Mason mentioned memory care, the Mercer Building North Star, or the Friday doctor. At first, she apologized after every sentence. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "You should have," I answered. She looked at me, surprised by the bluntness. "But being afraid explains why you delayed. It does not erase what the delay allowed. Both things can be true." That became our new rule. No pretending, no dramatic forgiveness, no family language used to hide a crime. On Thursday afternoon, Claire called Mason from my living room. The conversation was on speaker, but he did not know that Daniel and Rosa were in the next room. "Dad wants to sign tomorrow," Claire said. Mason's voice warmed. "Good. I told you this would work." "What happens after he signs?" "We move him for a few weeks. The doctor confirms the recommendation and Daniel stops interfering. Then North Star closes." "What about the fee?" "Don't worry about the fee. You will have enough to pay off the house and start over." "And Lily." There was a pause. Lily stays where she is. You are making this harder than it needs to be. Claire's hand tightened around the phone. You said we would be safe. You will be safe when you stop acting unstable. Daniel wrote something on a legal pad. Rosa looked at me through the doorway. The call ended when Mason said he would see her at the house Friday morning. Claire stared at the dark screen. I want to record the meeting, she said. Daniel shook his head. We follow the law in the state where the conversation occurs. We do not improvise. Then what can I do? You can tell the truth in front of witnesses. You can bring your attorney. You can refuse to sign. You can ask Mason questions and write down his answers immediately afterward. I added, and you can protect Lily by not letting him pull you into a private room. Claire took a long breath. I am scared. I know. I still have to do it. That was the first time she sounded like my daughter again. Not because she had become fearless, because she had decided fear would not be the only voice in the room. Before she left, she handed Daniel an envelope. Inside was a printed screenshot from Mason's phone, captured when he had asked her to forward a bank statement. At the top of the image was a contact name, Gordon Pike, North Star Legal Liaison. Under it, one message was visible. Friday after Frank signs. Then we own the building. Mason arrived at 9:45 Friday morning with Dr. Patel, a black leather folder, and a smile meant for a family that had already surrendered. I opened the door before they knocked a second time. Frank Mason said, You look rested. I slept well. His eyes moved past me into the house. He was looking for Claire, but she was not there. Daniel sat at the dining table with his briefcase open. Rosa stood near the window holding a cup of coffee. A family friend, Reverend Miles, had agreed to be present because I trusted his calm judgment. Mason's smile faded. We expected a private appointment. It is my house. I decide who sits at my table. Dr. Patel was a thin man with silver hair and an uncomfortable expression. He glanced at Mason before entering. Mr. Mercer, I was asked to conduct an evaluation. By whom? Your daughter requested it. My daughter is not in the room. Mason stepped forward. Claire is overwhelmed. She asked me to coordinate everything. Daniel closed his briefcase. Then she can confirm that in writing in front of counsel. Mason's jaw tightened. Dr. Patel placed his folder on the table. I can still ask Mr. Mercer a few questions, he said. You may, I replied. But before we begin, I would like to see the referral document that explains why you are here, Mason answered. The doctor does not need to show you private family paperwork. Dr. Patel looked at him. Actually, the patient has a right to know the purpose of an evaluation. The doctor opened the folder and removed a form. I recognized the clinic logo from the red folder. I also recognized the date. The form said I had visited the clinic 6 days earlier. I had been at the Mercer office that day. Rosa had the time-stamped entry record. This says I reported memory loss, I said. Dr. Patel frowned. It says the referral came with that concern. Who signed it? He studied the bottom of the page. The signature is not mine. Mason stood so fast his chair moved backward. This is unnecessary. Frank has been forgetful for months. Forgetful about what? I asked. Names, appointments, money. You mean the accountant whose name I corrected yesterday? The appointment you scheduled without telling me? Or the money you tried to access through my daughter? Dr. Patel looked from me to Mason. His professional concern had become something sharper. I will not conduct an evaluation based on a questionable referral, he said. Mason reached for the folder. Daniel moved between them. Leave the documents on the table. For the first time, Mason looked afraid. He turned toward the hallway. Claire did this. She has been manipulating all of you. The front door opened. Claire entered with Lily beside her and a woman I did not recognize behind them. The woman carried a small notebook and introduced herself as a family advocate. Claire looked at Mason. No, she said. You did this. I am here to tell the truth. Mason's phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked at the screen once. Then he tried to leave. Mason did not make it past the entryway. Not because I blocked him, but because Daniel stood beside the door and asked him to remain until everyone understood what had been presented. You cannot detain me, Mason said. We are not detaining you, Daniel replied. You are free to leave. If you do, the meeting continues without your explanation. Mason looked at Claire. You brought him here. I brought myself. Lily held Claire's hand. I noticed that Claire had placed herself between Mason and the child without making a show of it. We sat around the dining table, the same table where Claire had brought the care plan, the same table where Mason had eaten a sandwich and warned me that a buyer might take advantage of me. This time the folders were open, and every chair was occupied by someone who had a reason to be there. Daniel placed the original trust document in front of me. Frank confirmed that this is your signature. I did. He placed the forged authorization beside it. Confirmed that this is not. I did again. Mason leaned forward. Anyone can say that. Daniel did not look at him. That is why we have the original of the certified copy and an independent handwriting examiner prepared to review both. Dr. Patel explained that he had not referred me for an evaluation and that the form carrying his name appeared altered. He would send a written statement to the clinic's compliance office. Rosa placed the company access logs on the table. They showed Claire's account being used from Mason's laptop at 2:13 in the morning. The logs also showed the printer search and Mason's late-night entry into the archive room. Mason's breathing became visible in his chest. I was protecting the family, he said. I asked my one question. Why did you search for a new management company before I agreed to anything? He opened his mouth and closed it. Claire watched him. Why did you tell me Northstar would buy the building? She asked. Because it was an option. Why did you tell me Lily would be sent away if I refused to help? I never said that. The family advocate opened her notebook. Claire has documented the statement, and we have the voice message. Mason stood. This is a setup. Frank has been controlling all of you for years. He uses money to make people obey him. That accusation landed because some part of it was true. I had used money to solve problems quickly. I had paid bills instead of asking why they existed. I had helped Claire so often that she sometimes confused help with permission. I looked at her. Have I made you feel controlled? She took a breath. Sometimes. But you never threatened to take Lily from me. Mason's face turned gray. Daniel opened the last page of the Northstar packet. Then let us discuss who the buyer actually is. Mason looked at the document, and the confidence he had borrowed from everyone else's fear finally began to leave his face. Daniel slid a corporate filing across the table. It showed Northstar Urban Holdings owned a subsidiary called Pike Advisory Services. The registered manager of Pike Advisory was Gordon Pike, the same name on the screenshot from Mason's phone. Mason stared at the paper. That proves nothing, he said. It proves the buyer's legal liaison is connected to the fee listed in the red folder, Daniel answered. It also proves the preliminary agreement was prepared before Frank authorized any negotiation. Rosa placed a second page beside the filing. It was a bank notice addressed to Hale Equipment Recovery. The company owed money to a lender whose collection representative was Gordon Pike. Claire pressed one hand against her mouth. You told me Northstar was buying the building to invest in the neighborhood, she said. Mason's voice became flat. It is buying the building. For you. For us. You said the money would pay the debt. It would pay the debt and keep us together. I looked at him. You were going to use my building to refinance your company. You were going to leave everything to Claire anyway. After I died. Not while you were trying to declare me unable to think. Mason's hands began to shake. He pushed back from the table. Frank, you are making this sound worse than it is. You created a medical form for a doctor who never saw me. You accessed private records. You entered my archive at midnight. You prepared a property sale and a fee for your own debt. Tell me which part sounds harmless. No one answered for him. Claire turned toward Daniel. What happens now? Daniel spoke carefully. The family can separate the issues. The suspected forgery, unauthorized access, and financial arrangement go to the appropriate investigators and institutions. Claire's safety and Lily's welfare require a separate plan. Frank's trust remains under its existing terms. No transfer occurs. Mason laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You think a lawyer can make me disappear? No, Daniel said. Your own records will decide what happens next. Dr. Patel left his statement with Daniel. Rosa secured the company files. The advocate took Claire and Lily into the living room to discuss immediate safety. Mason remained at the table staring at the original trust. You never trusted me, he said. Trust is built through behavior. I was trying to save my family. You were trying to save your control. His phone buzzed again. This time I saw the screen. A message from Gordon Pike appeared beneath the lock screen. If Frank does not sign today, the lender files Monday. Mason turned the phone face down. I did not touch it. I did not need to. The message had arrived in front of 6 witnesses. The Friday deadline had not been mine. It had belonged to Mason all along. He had mistaken my patience for weakness, my age for helplessness, and my love for a blank check. Those mistakes were his, but the people he frightened would have to live with the damage after he was gone. Mason did not leave the house in handcuffs. Real consequences rarely arrive with the clean timing of a television scene. He left after Daniel explained that continuing the conversation was no longer useful, and after the family advocate confirmed Claire and Lily would not return with him. At the door, Mason looked at me. "You are destroying your daughter." I answered, "I am refusing to let you destroy her for me." He walked to his car. He did not look back at Claire. The moment the car turned onto the street, Claire folded against the wall. Lily wrapped both arms around her waist. I stood a few feet away, unsure whether touching my daughter would help or frighten her. Daniel closed the curtains. "The next step is preservation," he said. "Everyone writes down what happened while it is fresh. No one deletes messages. No one contacts Mason alone." We moved to the dining table again. Rosa created a timeline from the access logs. Dr. Patel sent his statement through the clinic's secure email. The family advocate photographed the red folder and sealed it in an evidence envelope. Claire described the night Mason first mentioned memory care. He had waited until Lily was asleep, then placed a spreadsheet in front of her. It listed the value of the Mercer building, the estimated sale price, and the amount of Hale Equipment's debt. "He told me you would never give us enough to survive," she said. "He said your trust was an insult because you trusted strangers more than your own family." "Did he show you a letter from North Star?" "Yes, he said the buyer was ready." Rosa looked at the timeline. The inquiry was sent before Mason showed Claire the spreadsheet. Claire closed her eyes. "I knew he wanted money," she said. "I did not know he had already promised the building." Daniel asked whether Mason had ever entered the archive room with her. "Once. He told Lily the black room held her future. I thought he was being sentimental." "What did he photograph?" Claire remembered. "The trust cover page, the lease schedule, a folder with your company seal." Rosa opened the company report. The late-night login accessed the lease schedule and downloaded capacity notes. It did not access payroll. Mason wanted property and medical language, not company operations. That distinction mattered. He was not trying to take my entire life. He wanted one building and the legal story that would unlock it. I looked at Lily's drawing on the table. The black rectangle under the house had been her way of warning me about a room she did not understand. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "is Mason going to come back?" I knelt beside her. "Not tonight. The adults are making sure you are safe. Did I do something bad? You told the truth. That is never the bad thing." Daniel placed his pen down. "Frank, the truth will not fix everything today, but it gives every responsible person a place to begin. For once, I let that be enough." Claire told the truth in 3 places that week, to Daniel, to the clinic investigator, and to herself. The first 2 were easier. They had forms, dates, and questions. The third happened late at night in my kitchen after Lily had fallen asleep in the guest room and the house had become quiet. Claire sat with a mug of tea she never drank. "I kept thinking I could stop him without making him angry," she said. "That is how control works. It makes every honest choice feel dangerous. I still brought you the documents." "Yes." "I still asked you to sign." "Yes." She looked down. "You can be angry with me." "I am angry." Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. "I am also glad you came back before Friday." Both things are true. That was harder for her to hear than forgiveness would have been. Forgiveness can close a conversation. Accountability keeps it open. She told me Mason had started controlling money after their 2nd year of marriage. He moved payments into accounts she could not see. He told her that if she challenged him, he would tell everyone she was unstable. When Lily began having nightmares, Claire blamed herself for not leaving sooner. "You are not responsible for his choices," I said. "But from now on, you are responsible for your choices." She nodded. "What does that mean?" It means you do not receive money from the trust just because you are my daughter. It means any help comes through written terms and independent oversight. It means you cannot use Lily to make me feel guilty, and I cannot use money to make you obey me. Claire stared at me. You would still help me? I will help you get safe. I will not rescue you from every consequence. The family advocate helped Claire file for emergency protections. Daniel arranged for the trust to remain unchanged and notified the relevant institutions about the questionable documents. Rosa changed every company password and removed Mason's access from the building system. Mason's lender contacted him. Northstar withdrew from the proposed purchase. The clinic opened an internal review because its name had been used on a form without authorization. None of those events made me feel victorious. They made me tired. On Sunday morning, Lily asked whether we could walk around the house. She stopped at the pantry door and looked at the place where I'd stood while hearing the Friday plan. Were you scared? She asked. Yes, but you didn't yell. Yelling would have made the truth harder to hear. She thought about that. When I grow up, I want a red door. You can have any color you want. A red one means people know where to come. I looked at Claire, who was standing in the hallway. Then we will build you a house with the strongest door in town, I said. This time I did not mean a building. It meant a life where Lily could grow up knowing that adults were responsible for their own choices. People expected me to ruin Mason. A few employees who knew what had happened suggested I buy his company just to close it. One of the lenders wanted me to pressure him into signing a confession. A family friend told me the best justice would be for Mason to lose everything he had tried to take. I understood the feeling. I had imagined it myself during the first night after the pantry conversation. I imagined Mason standing outside my office with nothing but the same smile he had brought into my kitchen. But revenge would have made the story about my anger. The truth was larger than that. Daniel explained the difference while we reviewed the next steps. You can cooperate with an investigation, he said. You can protect your property. You can support Claire's safety. You cannot turn legal processes into a private punishment. What if he gets away with it? Then we keep the record accurate. We do not make it easier for him by doing something reckless. Rosa agreed. She had changed the company passwords, but she refused to move the money in a way that could be misunderstood. A clean record protects you longer than a clever trick, she said. So we documented. The security footage went to Daniel. The access logs went to the company compliance officer. The clinic form went to the clinic's review team. Claire's messages went to the advocate, helping her with safety planning. The original trust remained in Daniel's office. Mason was questioned about the forged authorization and the proposed sale. I did not attend every conversation. I did not need to hear every answer to know the pattern was being examined by people whose job was not to protect my feelings. The bank placed a temporary hold on the transaction connected to Northstar. The lender requested additional records. Mason's business partners began asking why a building he did not own had appeared in his repayment plan. The consequences spread through the channels he had tried to avoid. Claire found a small apartment near Lily's school. She started working with a counselor who was not connected to Mason. She also began repaying the money she had taken from my emergency account during the months when he controlled the bills. I told her she could keep the money until she was stable. She refused. If I keep pretending it was nothing, I will become like him, she said. That sentence was the first evidence that accountability was becoming real. Lily visited my house on Saturdays. We repaired the loose pantry hinge and painted the door red. She insisted on choosing the color, and she selected a shade called Fire Engine because it was impossible to misunderstand. When the paint dried, she stood on the porch and inspected it. Now people know where to come, she said. I looked at the house behind her. For years, I had thought a home was the thing I needed to leave my family. That week, I learned a home was the thing I needed to make safe while I was still alive. The building remained in the trust. The future did not belong to Mason. It belonged to the people willing to protect it honestly. 3 months after the Friday meeting, Claire asked to see me at the Mercer building. She arrived with a binder of budget and the serious expression of someone who had stopped waiting for life to become easier. I want to show you something, she said. The binder contained her new lease of work schedule, counseling appointments, and a repayment plan for the money she had borrowed. It also contained a letter she had written to Lily explaining that adults sometimes make unsafe choices and children are never responsible for fixing them. I read the letter twice. "You do not have to show me all of this," I said. "I want to." That difference mattered. We walked through the building. The dental office had expanded. The physical therapy clinic had leased another room. The apartments were occupied, and Thomas had repaired the mailbox panel. The archive room remained locked. Claire stopped outside it. "I know I cannot go in there without permission. You can go in with Daniel, Rosa, or me." "I do not want to." She placed her hand on the red binder. "I used to think the trust meant you did not trust me. Now I understand that it was supposed to protect Lily from whatever any of us might become under pressure." I leaned against the hallway wall. A document cannot make people honest. It can make dishonesty harder. Then I want Lily's future to be harder to steal. She had prepared a proposal. Not a new trust, not a request for early money, but a family charter describing access, oversight, and emergency decisions. Daniel would review it. Claire wanted Lily to understand the rules when she was old enough. I agreed to discuss it. Then I gave Claire my own rule. "If you ever believe I'm losing capacity, you tell me directly and bring Daniel. You do not bring a secret doctor. You do not create a plan behind a pantry door." She nodded. "And if you think I am using money to control you, you tell me." I nodded back. For years, I had thought love meant providing until nobody needed to ask. That idea had made me generous, but it had also made my family dependent on my silence. I gave money quickly because asking questions felt like rejection. I paid debts because boundaries felt cruel. I called it protection because that word sounded better than fear. Claire had learned from me in ways I never intended. We sat in the small conference room where Rosa kept the company records. I signed no transfer. Claire signed no authorization. We wrote questions instead. What does Lily need? What does Claire need to become independent? What does Frank need to remain respected in his own home? The answers were not dramatic. Safe housing, honest budgets, independent advice, no secret signatures, no threats disguised as concern. When we finished, Claire asked whether I could forgive her. "I am working on it," I said. "Is that a no?" "It is an honest answer." She smiled for the first time in months. "I think honest is better." So did I. The following spring, Lily and I stood in front of the house with paint on our hands. The red door had survived winter and 2 packages of sidewalk salt. Lily held a small wooden sign. It said, "Come in honest," in crooked blue letters. "Can we hang it here?" she asked. "Right above the bell." She climbed the step stool while I steadied it. Claire watched from the driveway carrying groceries. Her life was not perfect. She still had difficult mornings. She still looked over her shoulder when an unknown number called. But she no longer treated fear as proof that another person deserved control. The Mercer building remained in the trust. The archive room remained locked. The original documents remained with Daniel, and every family meeting now began with a simple question: who is allowed to decide and why? Mason's case moved slowly through the systems designed to examine financial misconduct and document fraud. I learned that justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is a file number, a bank, hold a professional review, and a person who finally stops changing her story to protect the man who caused the danger. I did not follow every update. My life could not be measured by Mason's consequences. It was measured by Lily sleeping through the night, by Claire paying her own rent, by Rosa teasing me for keeping 6 different notebooks, by the fact that I could enter my kitchen without looking at the pantry door and hearing the words "Friday deadline" in my head. One evening, Claire sat beside me on the porch. "Do you ever wish you had confronted us the first night?" she asked. I considered the question. "I wish I had known how to protect you without treating you like a child. I wish I had asked better questions sooner. But I do not wish I had handed Mason a warning." She nodded. "I was so sure you would hate me. I was hurt by what you did. That is different from believing you were beyond repair." The porch light came on. Lily was setting 3 plates on the table. She had drawn a black rectangle under the house again, but filled it with yellow stars. "What is the room now?" I asked. She opened the door. "A place where we keep the important things," she said. She was right. Important things were not only deeds, contracts, or money. They were the truth, the courage to tell it, and the boundaries that kept love from becoming a weapon. I had heard my daughter whisper that my future would be taken by Friday. She had been wrong about one thing. My future was never a building, a trust, or a signature. It was the chance to choose what kind of father I would be after the people I loved disappointed me. I chose to be protective without being controlling, firm without becoming cruel, forgiving without pretending nothing happened. And if someone you love ever tells you that surrender is the only proof of trust, remember this: love can open the door, but honesty gets to decide who walks through it. What would you protect first if your family tried to take your future from you, your home, your dignity, or the person you love most?